Silver Star, the third highest medal in the country. It doesn't mean anything. Bob Neal died for these medals. Lieutenant Pomerol died, so I got a medal. Sergeant Johns died, so I got a medal. I got a Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 air medals, National Defense, and the rest of this garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
The Vietnam War was arguably the most controversial in American history. Through the 1950s to the 70s, there was a dramatic shift in world culture from the infamous anti-war hippie movement that defined the time period to the widespread public discourse surrounding American involvement in Vietnam that captured the attention of the global public. Through the evaluation of the methods and goals of a variety of anti-war groups globally, and through the exploration of historian perspectives on anti-war culture throughout the 60s and 70s, the undeniable effects of the war on the general public are revealed. There were 3 main categories that these anti-war groups fell into, but each group had their own specific objectives, ideology, and methods. Many, however, had very discordant ideologies and became notably exclusatory.
The American liberals felt that the war diverted resources from more important foreign objectives and were opposed to the authoritarian regime in Saigon. They believed in the power of education, electoral politics, and peaceful protests, and wanted a negotiated settlement in Vietnam rather than continued fighting. The liberals also distrusted the communists and thought that associating with them would ruin their reputation. This led liberals to leaving communists out of events and other parts of the liberal movement against Vietnam. The National Coordinating Committee to End the War in Vietnam actually even refused to endorse a rally in 1965 held by Singh just because it included communists.
Sometimes these disharmonious views caused groups to disintegrate from the inside out.
Pacifists were split into moderate and radical camps and had a lot of overlap in membership with the liberals. Pacifists put the blame for the war equally on the United States and the Soviet Union, but certain methods and goals differed between the moderates and the radicals. The moderates believed that the best methods for change were electoral politics, political lobbying, and direct action to change what they saw as a mistake in policy about Vietnam. They believed the best way to end the conflict would be a settlement accepted by all parties involved, including the North Vietnamese. On the other hand, the radicals felt that electoral politics were unproductive and instead preferred to advocate with nonviolent civil disobedience. The radicals also believed the war was a symptom of the fundamental issues ingrained in American society. They did not believe in a settlement, but rather they thought that the Vietnamese were the only ones with the right to determine their future, and therefore thought the U.S. should withdraw and not be involved in the settlement.
The pacifists were inclusive and aimed to create the biggest coalition possible. They made it a prevalent point to avoid the exclusion of anyone or any group, no matter their radicality, from their protests. The third and final classification of ideologies involved in the movement were the leftists.
The leftists were a minority in the anti-war movement and were made up of the old communist and socialist workers' parties. They protested using peaceful demonstration and demanded that the U.S. pull out from Vietnam. From the leftists, the New Left Students for Democratic Society formed as a liberal reform organization. The tactics of SDS became increasingly violent through the years, and they even abandoned their local membership to stay predominantly reformist. Interestingly enough, this group rejected both communist and capitalist views.
Spanning all classified ideologies, however, college students loudly and unapologetically had an undeniable involvement in the anti-war movement. During the 1960s, protests against the U.S.'s presence in Vietnam were scattered and disorganized. However, after Operation Rolling Thunder began in 1965, various groups, but most prominently students, were able to garner more widespread support and stage small but noticeable protests.
The baby boomers went from the quiet, apathetic generation to very unpopular messengers, adamant about stopping the war. This movement is oftentimes looked at as an amalgamation of 60s to 70s cultural transformations, but by the end of the 1960s, only 20% of students had taken part in anti-war demonstrations. The majority of these students were middle or upper middle class humanities or social science majors who viewed U.S. intervention in Vietnam as a correctable foreign policy mistake rather than the result of an irreparably flawed capitalistic system that should be overthrown. That being said, that majority was not the group receiving the most attention. Good job.
The Students for a Democratic Society was an active and radical student youth group established in 1959. They believed in a nonviolent way to transform U.S. society into a model political system. Their demonstrations were mostly on college campuses, but on April 17, 1965, they held the largest demonstration of the time with over 20,000 participants gathering in Washington, D.C. to protest. The message of the demonstration was clear. Citizens would not quietly accept the war in Vietnam. The group had garnered over 100,000 members before breaking apart over internal squabbles. The National Coordinating Committee to End the War in Vietnam organized international days of protest later that year, marking a period of collaboration after the SDS March.
The SDS were prominent in important protests. That being said, they had no clear central strategy or direction. The opposing student group at this point was the Young Americans for Freedom, who some historians say membership even passed the SDS. But despite both receiving a lot of attention, neither represented a significant percentage of 1960 students.
In 1969, the first draft since 1942 began, which subsequently caused momentum in the anti-war movement.
Johnson opted to draft undergraduate men below a C-point grade average. This decision caused protests due to its unjust nature.
With this gained momentum and national attention, instances of violence became more frequent. There were mass teach-ins and a growing movement, but even after the 1960s, the majority of the country still supported the war. That being said, there was an abundance of pressure placed upon public officials.
There was a focus against the draft system at Chicago sit-ins in 1966, and widespread demonstrations against the draft. 210,000 men were accused of draft-related offenses, 25,000 were indicted, and 30,000 left the country into exile, primarily into Canada, Sweden, and Mexico.
Those not in college or of any lower-class individuals were the majority of the drafted population, and those above a C average in undergraduate college were immune from this threat.
Even with all this opposition and these instances of violence, 90% of the demonstrations were peaceful. The violence was simply covered more. And that was kind of grouped into the hippie counterculture that was already horrifying Middle America. One aspect of these protests was the moratorium, which was the largest public protest in the nation's history, and the single most important one-day demonstration of the entire war, with more than 2 million participants developed by Senator Eugene McCarthy. There were silent vigils, memorial flowers, and tree plantings, quiet prayers, and teach-ins.
Nixon then countered the moratorium with a 500,000 people demonstration. 1969 would see the end of the draft based on income, race, and education. People from all over North Vietnam were against the war. Similar to the U.S. movement, all of these people had different methods of protesting and ideas of the ideal situation or replacement for the war.
Some people never wanted to go to war to liberate the South in the first place, and believed the North should work to reunify Vietnam through peaceful political means. Any protest to the war was often small-scale and quiet due to restrictive rules, but some were more bold when it came to standing up to the government. Many anti-war musicians and artists created pieces that portray the horrors of war or just presented a more nuanced depiction of the battle, but these were considered highly illegal as art that was produced under the Communist Party was generally supposed to have the sole value of supporting the party's policies.
Music that went against the war was named yellow music and strictly banned. However, the line between what was yellow music and what was not was fairly blurred, and so some artists could make a case for their music.
A few musicians formed a band and began playing pre-war love songs and other romantic music at weddings and parties that they knew broke the law, but when they were asked about it, they stated their songs were not directly political in their minds. However, starting in the summer of 1967, the party's organizational chief and the Minister of Public Security carried out mass arrests of supposed traitors and treasonous elements, whom they labeled revisionists. The musicians and others like them were eventually arrested in 1968.
The widespread demonstrations and varied methods of opposition to the Vietnam War displays the complexities of activism and the importance of ideological guidance and garnering attention from the general public. It is crucial to avoid the reductionist approach to historical movements and understand the nuances of every individual contribution. Each group had different goal sets and different methods to achieve them, yet oftentimes collaboration could change the tides of history. Vietnam is an important example of this due to the public access to oppositional movements due to the popularization of live broadcasting, even to the small extent available at the time. Currently, live broadcasting is widely accessible, and attention for any movement for change can be easily acquired through the use of social media.